Land Registry reports that the average conveyancing transactions are actually taking around 153 days, and that's about 5 months. So pretty much everybody who said about 4 to 5 months was right. So in order to understand why there are these delays, I guess everybody needs to know what the conveyancing process is in order to be able to work out what a conveyancer might be doing during the course of the instruction and how you could help to speed that up. So let's have a look. So there's effectively 3 stages that need to sort of be processed. The first one, which requires a lot of input from clients, is the onboarding stage. So onboarding is when you're becoming a client of the firm. So there's protocols that the firm need to follow that we then require you to provide information for. And the second one is actually preparing for exchange of contracts. So that's the point at which your contract to purchase the property or sell your property becomes binding in law. So all of the background work, all the due diligence, all the searches and inquiries need to have been completed by the time we're ready to exchange contracts. And then, of course, the lovely final stage is when we're ready to actually complete our purchase or the sale. And that's always it's always lovely once we've exchanged and we're heading towards completion. So there are various stages of the conveyancing transaction, and this little illustration sort of shows the first sort of 3 stages, which really is where we're starting off our conveyancing process. So you find your property, you put it up for sale, your buyer finds a suitable property, you do a deal, you get a quote out, you accept the quote from the solicitors, and then you move on to dealing with verification of ID and source of funds and so on. When you're choosing your solicitor, there's quite a few things that you need to take into account when you're selecting your solicitor. And there's a few things that I've put down here, and there's probably a load more that you could be thinking about. But what I would consider is think about the complexity of your sale, your purchase. Does it involve any special features? And would the firm that you're selecting be able to cope with that? Will they be able to deal with the whole transaction, all of the lender's requirements, and anything specific about the property? So that's the first thing. Secondly, I would say is get recommendations from your estate agent, from other professionals like accountants and brokers, and speak to your friends, family and colleagues as if they've recently moved, find out what their experience was and whether that's something that you would like to have or whether there's some improvement that could be made there. And then consider, when you do find the firm, consider their reputation. How long have they been in practice for? Has the firm been around a long time? Because a firm that's been around a long time can often demonstrate the ability that they've annually been able to renew their professional indemnity insurances, they haven't had a big claims history, and they're pretty secure and they're in a good place. So that's really important. Again, if you're going for a new firm, there's just a few checks that you can do. You can ensure that the company, that the law firm has got certain accreditations and that they comply with certain protocols. So, for instance, all law firms do have an opportunity to be accredited to the Lexel quality mark, and it's like a quality mark for lawyers, which means that our files are regularly audited. We have to comply with special services, special client services, and we are subject to on-the-spot checks. The other accreditation that's really important for conveyancing actually is the Conveyancing Quality Standard, the CQS. So if a firm has adhered to that and your other firm who's acting for the buyer or the seller has also adhered to that, what you'll find is that both lawyers should be speaking and accepting that there are certain things that they will do that are, there are certain inquiries that they will raise which are within the protocol. And so they're not asking questions that actually are irrelevant or not necessary. And the process is then driven by the protocol itself. Oh, I did want to say one other thing. And consider who else is who's doing the work. So is it actually going to be a solicitor who's doing your work? Is the person qualified? Do they have sufficient experience? And who's supervising them? And how easily is that person contactable? Have a chat about those sort of things. So rather than just getting a quote and accepting it because perhaps, it seems fair, get in touch with the law firm and have a word with the person that prepared the quote, have a little chat about it, get a feel for the delivery of service. And I think that would work really well for sort of creating a relationship going forward, particularly if you're buying and selling properties often. So let's have a look at those things that you need to do for the law firm in terms of onboarding. So You will all have at some point, if you've bought property, had to go into a law firm with your identity documentation and verify that. So you've had to take it somewhere and get somebody to take a photocopy and stamp it and so on to verify that that's an original document and that they verified your ID. Why do we have to do this? Well, we have to do this to comply with anti-money laundering regulations, and that's a government legislation that we have to adhere to, and it's there in place to safeguard our funds generally and protect transactions from corruption, money laundering and crime. So what documents are needed? So what if you can already be preparing for the sort of documents that are going to be needed for verifying your ID, you could get those lined up rather than sort of having a last minute dash to try and get all of that information. It can be quite stressful at the beginning for a buyer or a seller. So we tend to ask for one proof of ID, so that could be your driver's license and your passport, and then we ask for 2 proofs of address. So it has to be something like a utility bill, a bank statement, council tax bill, maybe a tax return, something official. We can't accept things like mobile bill statements or sort of insurance documentation or anything like that. It has to be pretty much official. So how do we verify ID and who can actually verify the ID? So the documentation needs to be verified by somebody who's regulated by the Financial Services Authority or a lawyer. So you can go to another solicitor, you can go to a mortgage broker and some estate agents also. So those are the sort of people that you can get your documents verified from, banks as well. However, nowadays it's so much easier than taking your documents anyway. You can do them electronically. So most law firms now will have a procedure whereby you don't actually have to leave your living room. You can do the verification of your identity documents from an application on your mobile or your laptop or something. So it's so much easier. So on this slide, I want to talk a little bit about source of funds. So when you're buying a property, usually the estate agent will say, can you provide source of funds? Well, lawyers will also have to do that. So again, we're complying with anti-money laundering regulations. Source of funds can be asked for before exchange of contracts, but in order to avoid any sort of delays or problems later, start talking about source of funds straight away. Don't wait for somebody to raise it with you. So the sort of things that you'll need to provide are about 3 to 6 months worth of bank statements to show where the monies are coming from. If you are having money come from a third party, so like a mum, dad, friend, cousin, relative, and they're gifting the money to you, then let us know, because we would then need to verify their identity, and we'd also need them to provide their source of funds to show where their money came from. Those sort of things can cause delays later, so it's best to get that started straight away. Now, with regard to a gift, there's other documentation that would be required. So the person who's gifting, so the giftor, would need to provide a letter or a statement confirming that they're making a gift, and there may be some other documentation that they need to sign, some other declarations. So what do we need to see to verify the source of funds? So I've kind of alluded to that already. We'd need to have a look at the ID of the individuals, and we'd also need to look at their bank statements. Once we've looked at the bank statements, we may have further questions that we need to ask, and we will then collate that information. And once that satisfies source of funds, that's all ticked off and we're ready to go. Another thing that we could sort of start thinking about right at the beginning, before we start thinking about solicitors, or just at the beginning of instructing a solicitor, is let's have a think about firms' questionnaires, because law firms will have their own questionnaires. So as I mentioned in my Instagram post with Vanessa, firms will have their own policies in relation to the data that they need to collect, and it's really important that if a law firm sends you some questionnaires, you fill them in and send them back as quickly as possible. It's all part of the onboarding process. Again, with their client agreement, they will send you a client agreement, and within that will set out exactly what they're going to do for you, the fees they're going to charge, and the costs like search fees and stamp duty and so on. And then it will also set out the time frame of the transaction and the terms and conditions. So those are all really important things, because not only are you purchasing a property, you're also, retaining a lawyer to undertake your work. So it's important you have a look at that and you're comfortable with anything in there. And if you're not, you need to be speaking to your solicitor to get clarification on it. And then we would ask for you to pay a retainer on account of searches and some legal fees. With regard to certain protocol forms, right. So I just wanted to demonstrate that modern law firms nowadays have got applications in place where you can get regular updates on your transaction, and also fill in all your forms and questionnaires over a mobile phone and hit the send button, and the document comes straight back to us. So there isn't this need to find time to print something off, fill it in, then post it, and all of that causing delays. So now if you can just fill it all in electronically on a smart form, scan it back to us, it's ready to go. So here we've sort of reached we've done stage 1, we've done stage 2, we've signed up, lawyers are all instructed. They will have applied for all the searches, and hopefully all that's good and reported back to you. The mortgage offers come in, and they'll be applying for, they would have reported to you on the mortgage and the terms of the mortgage. So we're moving towards, let's get ready for exchange of contract. Well, that's really important because obviously once we've exchanged contracts, everything's binding. So there's a few things as a seller that you should bear in mind, and the documentation that you need to provide are called protocol forms. So they're Law Society protocol forms. All lawyers use the same forms. No matter where you go, which solicitor you instruct, is always going to be the Law Society protocol forms. So you're never going to get an odd set of inquiries that come from a law firm that you've never seen before. So it's all very recognisable. That should streamline and shorten the process. But there are certain things that you can do to help that. So the protocol form is actually the seller's duty to provide. So as soon as you've instructed your solicitors, they'll send you the protocol forms for your sale property, and it will cover things like the ownership of the boundary. So you'll have to mark on a plan, or you'll have to indicate on the form which boundaries on the left, right, front or the back of the property you own or is owned by the neighbour. You'll also need to set out any details that relate to building regulations and planning permissions. So, for instance, if you've recently, taken down some walls inside the house, that relates to building regulations, or you've had some gas or electric works, again, building regulations could apply. Again, with planning permissions, if you've had an extension in the sort of last 5 years, you should have copies of all of the planning applications, and you should have the sign-off as well. So the certificate of completion for any of that work that's been done. You need to gather all that information together. Yes, the information usually is available at the local authority, but by the time the solicitor's got all the documentation in, they're then spending more time looking for that information online. Whereas if you've got it to hand, you could be scanning it all into a shared folder and issuing it to the solicitor straight away. So there's other things that you need to think about. So thinking about the cost of your bills. So anyone buying property, they'd be interested to know roughly, what the charges are. So again, you can supply all the details with regards to services there. Then there's specific things like whether the property's been subject to any flooding or any sort of defects in relation to the building of the property. And then gas and electricity certificates, which I'll come on to in a bit. Energy performance certificates. So by law, you have to have an energy performance certificate. Most people will have got one before they put the property on the market or shortly after they put it on the market, but you'll definitely need one when you come to sell. So you don't want to hold up things just for the sake of an EPC, so you might as well get that. They're valid for about 5 years, I think. So the other thing that the form covers are the common parts and any shared parts with the neighbour. So if you've got a flat and you're on the 3rd floor, is there a lift? Are there stairs? All those sort of things. And is there a sort of courtyard or something common, bin stores and those sort of things? And then you need to provide information about things like Japanese knotweed and septic tanks if you don't have. So Japanese knotweed is obviously a weed which is injurious to properties, and there's specific management requirements for that. And as septic tanks, if you don't have your sewers connected to public sewers, so there'll be specific inquiries in relation to those. But what I would say is when you are replying to the protocol forms, you can't just say no. You can only say no if you're absolutely 100% sure that you don't have Japanese knotweed, because if you said no to Japanese knotweed, the chances are that the other side will say, well, can you let us have a copy of the report that said there isn't Japanese knotweed? So you're better off saying, so far as you're aware, there isn't, but obviously the buyer needs to undertake their own investigations for that. And your lawyer will look after you in relation to the accuracy of the responses. So we're just talking now about gas certificates and whose responsibility is what. So the gas safety certificate or building regulations compliance certificate is always needed when you have any installation concerning any gas appliance. So if it's related to gas and you've had that done in your property, you should have received a gas safety certificate or a building regulations compliance certificate. So if you're the person who undertook the work is a competent person, they should be able to issue with the right certificate. And if they can't, if they haven't, or they did and it's gone missing, you can find a replacement on this link here. So what is a gas safety record then, on the other hand? So a gas safety record is what the landlord must have. And these are useful to keep handy on the sale of residential property if the service has recently been done in the last 12 months. Electricity certificates. So electricity safety certificates, these are strictly not required when selling a property, but it does give the buyer peace of mind that the electrics are safe and that the seller has been looking after and maintaining the property in the right way. So if you have a recent certificate, it's worthwhile just sharing that. However, with regard to landlords, they must have a certificate. It has to be rated satisfactory and it must have been provided by a qualified electrician before the tenant actually moved into the rental property. If the landlord is selling the property with the tenant in place, they will need to provide a valid certificate to the buyer. So let's say, for instance, if the tenant is already in occupation and the landlord has obviously got to go and get a certificate because they haven't got one. Once they've got the report, they need to provide it to the tenant within 28 days. And if the local authority asks for a copy of the report, it needs to be provided within 7 days. And the report itself is valid for 5 years. It's quite important at this point to note that if you don't, as a landlord, comply with those regulations, then there are financial penalties up to 30,000 that can be issued by the local authority. So moving on to other things like asbestos management reports. So this is an interesting one. So for commercial properties built before 2000, the owner should have a management report, okay? And the buyer can insist that the seller provides it. So that's for commercial property. For residential property that's built before 2000, you are recommended to have an asbestos management report, but it's not a prerequisite. However, if you're a landlord of residential property that was built before 2000, then you must have an asbestos management report to cover the common parts, because those are the parts of the building that you still have control over. So asbestos is all about understanding whether there's asbestos. Asbestos regulations and the management reports are all about understanding whether there is actually asbestos in the property. And if there is, it doesn't condemn the property. It just means that there has to be a proper management plan in place to manage and control that asbestos so it isn't injurious to people. So what happens if you didn't have the building regulations for that wall that you took down in the kitchen, or a conservatory work or some planning permissions? What can you do? So there may be an opportunity to obtain some indemnity insurances. And I'm sure if you've bought or sold properties before, you will have come across things like chancel insurance, chancel indemnity insurance, or you can get planning permission insurances, and you can get building regulation indemnity insurances. And these basically protect the owner and the lender in case anyone should enforce against an infringement of any of those laws. Okay, and there are other instances as well. One of the key things that you need to bear in mind is that if an indemnity insurance is discussed in order to progress the transaction, the chances are that the seller will need to bear the cost of that, unless, of course, the buyer agrees to share the cost. But the onus really is down to the seller to provide clean and clear title. So if it's a defect, it needs to be corrected, it's probably going to be down to the seller. So, in a nutshell, there's a couple of things that we can consider. We can consider all the things that are in our control and all the things that aren't in our control. So, number one, on a purchase, get your mortgage in principle as soon as possible. So if you can get your mortgage in principle agreed up front, you know that as soon as you find your property, you can get your mortgage application through and evaluation done. At the moment, mortgage offers are taking between 2 and 4 weeks. We have clients who instruct us and they're very eager, and nothing happens for ages because we just don't have a mortgage offer. It delays us putting in searches because the mortgage offer hasn't come in. Clients are sort of in two minds. Should I put the cost in for the searches? I haven't got my mortgage offer. I might not even get it. Interest rates are going up. Will I be able to afford the repayments? So all of these things will actually add to the time that a transaction takes. Contact your solicitor early on and complete all the onboarding and be ready. So pay your money, sign up all the documentation, fill in any protocol forms, and start sending all the documentation to your solicitor. Number 3, start collecting all your paperwork together in advance. So if you're selling a property and you've got mortgages to redeem, get those mortgages, get those redemption statements, make contact, or prepare a list with all the account numbers and things for all of those redemptions and things, so you can provide it to your solicitor, an address, contact details, a fax number if you've got it. Get your ID and your source of funds ready and start thinking about any planning permissions and building regulations that you need. Fill in all the forms and return them back to your solicitor as soon as you possibly can. Consider gathering the ID for all of the parties involved in the transaction. So, for instance, if you've got a transaction where the owner has passed away, you need to be thinking about getting the will sorted, getting a copy of the will, looking at getting the grant of probate. We've had transactions where we've been instructed and grant of probate's taking ages because it hasn't been applied for. The grant of probate can take 4 to 6 weeks itself. So imagine the delays that can be caused because you're waiting for a grant. Okay, so you need to be talking to your solicitor about that right at the beginning, about these sort of things. And that actually has a knock-on effect on whether somebody else in the chain is in that scenario, because again, that person's going to be affecting you. So number 6, before instructing your solicitor, consider any restrictions that there might be on the title where you need to get consent from a third party. So, for instance, some titles, for instance, for leasehold property, it will say before you can sell the property, you need to sign a deed of covenant to say that you're going to pay the service charges and the ground rents and all that. You need to get in touch with the management company. So provide that information as soon as possible. Get together all your rent receipts, all the service charge accounts, so that that's all ready to go to your solicitor. Speak to your management company and say, look, I'm looking to sell a property, what are your requirements going to be? And then at least when you go to your solicitor, you've already given them the email, the contact details. The solicitor can pay the fee and get on with obtaining all the information relating to the leasehold property. So lastly, what's not in our control? There's loads of things that aren't in our control when we're buying and selling properties. So when the seller's solicitor, we don't know when the seller's solicitor is actually going to issue their draft contract pack. Because if you think about it, they actually are also dealing with onboarding and dealing with getting redemption statements and all that sort of thing. So again, we don't know as a buyer when the seller's going to send their contract pack over. And we can't, as a buyer, we can't apply for our searches until we've got the contract pack. Number 2, we don't know when the searches are coming back. So, we apply for the searches and we're at the hands of the local authority or the search provider. Most law firms now will have hooked up with a pretty good reputable search company who will electronically provide all the searches. But when there are bottlenecks, so for instance, stamp duty deadlines or busy periods like people wanting to complete in the summer because the kids are starting school in September, or wanting to move now because it's the run up to Christmas, then you'll find that searches will take longer to come through because there's an influx of instructions. Number three, when is the mortgage offer actually going to be issued? Because, you know, if you've ever tried to get in touch with the valuer and find out when the valuation's being done or when the application is going to be reconsidered, it's not in our hands. So the quicker we can get in touch with lenders and start that ball rolling, the better, really. Something else that's not in our control is when you're in a transaction and there's an issue that needs to be reported to the lender. Well, we don't know how quickly the lender's going to deal with the issue. And if they've got umpteen numbers of other inquiries because they're particularly busy at the moment as well, then it can take longer to get their green light to proceed. Number four is really important, the length of the chain. If you're buying an investment property that's empty, and you've got nothing to sell, that's a win-win scenario. You're going to, you know, whiz through that transaction, all being well. But if you've got a chain where, you know, you've got a first-time buyer who doesn't know the conveyancing process, who maybe has instructed a bad law firm that's not so quick, or if you've got somebody who's the scenario where somebody's deceased and they're requiring grants of probate and so on, and even where land is unregistered and either the property needs to be registered or it's the title is particularly complicated, those sort of things can really affect the timing of the transaction. So those maybe are questions that you want to be asking when you're, you know, looking at the property or looking to sell your property, if you've got particular requirements as to which offer you're going to accept. Number five, think about special circumstances that might be affecting the sale or the purchase. For instance, if a sale is being done under a bankruptcy order, you're not going to be dealing with the owner, you're likely to be dealing with the receivers. So bear in mind that you will have third parties that you need to talk to. And again, I've mentioned unregistered property there. And then the last thing really that I thought actually really we don't have any control on is what's happening in the market. If interest rates start rising, people might get cold feet and feel that they can't buy, and it's cheaper for them to rent. So they may pull out altogether. So there's those sort of things to consider. So those are the things that we can consider when we're trying to find out how to sell our property in record time. So that's me, Harshinder Hundal, partner at Picton's. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much, Harshinder. That was really, really informative, and there's quite a few questions that's popping through the chat group. Like I said before, Harshinder started presenting her topics tonight. We're just going to drop a link in the chat box. So if you've got any very specific questions and you want to have a little bit more sort of smaller group personal time with myself and Harshinder, like I said, we're doing a mastermind next week, Thursday in the evening, and the link will be in the chat for you, if not now, in the next couple of seconds. And we can really get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of certain situations or personal questions related to a sale or a purchase. So please feel free. Like I said, we only have 8 spots available. So the first 8 to link into the chat will be invited to the mastermind. I mean, questions are sort of running through my mind. Like I said, we have some questions in the chat box. I think there's always this thing of why does it take so long? What is the solicitor doing? Is the solicitor doing the work? You know, am I just one of 200 conveyancing packs on your desk? So it was really useful, Harshinder, for you to shed the light on the process step by step. You know, the things that you do, the things that you can control, and the things that you can't. You know, really useful for us to be reminded of that. If I go to the chat box for a few questions here, we have a couple of questions here. So we've got, what if you're living with your parents? I think this is to do with the ID verification. So if you're selling a property, I think this means that you're living with your parents and you do not have official documents like the utility bills and council tax in your name, how do you then sort of prove your ID?
Yeah, well, if you're buying a property, you will have a bank statement. So you can provide your bank statement. You will have, if you're in employment, you'll have a P45. Sorry, not a P45. Hopefully you don't have a P45. You'll have a P60, and you'll have documentation from your employers. But 2 forms of bank statements would be fine if you've got more than 2 accounts. There are other ways around it. We can have a look at doing electronic ID searches. And maybe looking at insurance, national insurance documentation as well. So we can have a look at that.
Okay, real. I think we have some other questions here. So if another question here is, maybe this is more for me. Can you ask your estate agent to only show to only show viewings to potential buyers who have mortgages only. So from my point of view on that, yes and no. So what we do as an estate agent, when your property goes on the market with us and the buyer inquiries start coming through, we will do an initial fact find on the telephone, because obviously we don't want to be wasting your time, wasting anybody's time, showing buyers who would like to buy, have the best intentions to buy, but they've not yet been qualified for their finances. So one of the things that we always ask at VA when we're taking that buyer inquiry for a property is, have you got a mortgage in principle? Have you spoken to your broker? Do you have a broker? And if they're very airy-fairy about it, and we can tell, because if they say yes, we'll ask them who the mortgage in principle is with, how much is it for? And if they're not sure, or they're a little bit kind of airy-fairy with the information, then we say to them, look, we'd like you to have a chat. There's no obligation intended with our broker, who's independent, so that way we can push them through to a broker who can answer questions and hopefully get them to either complete a mortgage application for a principal, or at least validate kind of their circumstances. So absolutely, yes, that's important to also help speed up the process if somebody puts an offer in on your property. I think a really valid question here, which is useful, is Harshinder, are they fast track searches available for an additional fee? So rather than sit in the queue, can we fast track?
So what we tend to do is get in touch with our search provider and find out which search is going to be the quickest. And we can usually see that from the desktop. So we can tell our clients when the search has been applied for and how long it's going to take. And if there is a search there that is going to be quicker, we will discuss that with our client. If it's going to cost more, then we'll let our client know. But if there is an option, we would always go for it. We'd always suggest it to our client.
Okay, brilliant. I think that's really important, because what we're hearing at the moment is searches are taking sort of 4 to 6 weeks in some cases. And obviously you don't have any control over that. So that is something that really does lengthen the conveyancing sales process. So it's interesting to see if one can fast track, or like you said, if you've got recommendations as to which search avenue to go down to help speed things up. Another question here from the group is, does the gift money, does that need to come from an immediate family member? So if somebody's been gifted part of their funds?
No, I mean, you can have a gift from an aunt, an uncle, or friend. But again, we would, check their ID and look at their bank statements. You can have a loan scenario as well, where somebody gives you money that needs to be paid back, but most lenders wouldn't accept that. So it would need to be on the basis of a gift.
Okay, real. I think we have a comment here from Abdul Hassan. He says, I think I've asked all the questions on the chat, but that was good. Questions, thoughts, it's useful for everybody. I mean, I think one of the frustrations we always hear from sellers and buyers, to be fair, is, oh my God, why is it taking so long? Why is this legal side of things taking so long? I thought I'd be done and dusted. And here I am 16, 17 weeks later. So yeah, the information that you've shared tonight really does shed light on that, because sometimes we get the feeling that, is the solicitor really on our case file, or do you have 20, 30, 50 on your desk, and it's a case of, whoever shouts loudest, their file gets, put to the top. I mean, what would you say about things like that in terms of communication and, the speed at which solicitors do work when we're selling and buying?
Yeah, I mean, our teams will have 20 or 30 active files at any one time each, maybe more. And they will usually have an assistant. So between the two of them, they'll be able to divvy up their work so that one person is managing the calls and the inquiries and dealing with onboarding and all of the administration, whereas the fee earner, i.e. the solicitor or the lawyer, is actually dealing with reviewing the documentation, raising inquiries and dealing with those. There is a lot of paperwork. There is a lot of work, a lot of instructions, a lot of clients that need to be managed. But we tend to, and obviously with emails, it's almost required. You're almost required to answer and respond instantly. And sometimes clients will send you an email, but then call you to say, I've sent you an email. Lawyers will need to be given time to be working on a file and then intermittently pick up emails and address them. But sometimes there will be a chunk of time that they need to dedicate to one particular file. But with the questionnaires that are handed out right at the beginning, clients are given the opportunity to suggest or give reasons as to why their transaction needs to move by a particular date. So, for instance, somebody might say, instructing us in May, I need to move before the end of summer because my kids are going to a new school. We know that has to be done, so we will use that as a tool to prioritise our workloads. Same with a mortgage offer that may be coming up to expiry, is that we're very much aware of these dates and we're working with those in mind. And there'll be other transactions which are quite early on, and those are being dealt with by administrators. It can be a bit of a task, but an experienced conveyancer will usually be very sort of multitasking all the time to pick up one file and work on the next. But we don't have files anymore, so it's all electronic.
Yeah, that was my next thing, just to round off. I think everything is going especially since the pandemic. I mean, and now what we're seeing as agents is there's this new breed of solicitors for conveyancing that is all online. There's loads of what they call e-conveyancers. I don't know, what are your feelings, what are your thoughts around that, and does Picton's work in a very e-friendly way? Because we're seeing that with the e-conveyancing solicitor process, we're seeing quotes come through that arguably are relatively a lot cheaper sometimes than other solicitor firms that are more kind of traditional local based. But then what we do see on some transactions, that because it's an e-conveyancing process and there's very little human contact, if things go wrong or things are a little bit more complicated, the seller or the buyer comes a little bit unstuck because it is a pure e-format. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, and does it work similar at Picton's?
I think that I think our method or our philosophy is a bit of a hybrid of both. So where we can do things electronically because it streamlines processes, we will. But ultimately, there is a qualified lawyer behind the scenes working through all the documentation. So us as a law firm, we wouldn't tell our clients to go elsewhere to deal with things. We'd be able to deal with it within our own firm. So apart from when the pandemic happened and we couldn't have clients coming into the office and we weren't in the office, we can still have clients come and visit us to drop paperwork off or come and discuss, any particular title defects and things that need a bit more explanation. I certainly do that in commercial property, where clients come in and I need to show them large plans and we need to go through various rights and restrictions and things in relation to the title. So we can do that, but we're not a large scale conveyancing firm. We have other areas that we specialise in. So when we deal with our clients in conveyancing, we're not looking to take over the market. We're looking to deal with our conveyancing that's holistic and helps them to sort of get through their transactions in a timely manner. And we do manage the workload of our staff throughout, because our staff are really important to us, so the well-being of them is important. So we know where the thresholds for them sort of ends, really.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I think that's those are fair points there. And I think that concludes it. I don't think I missed any questions in the chat, so that concludes our Q&A. And like I said, the link was popped in the chat box for anyone who wants to come along to the mastermind next week, Thursday in the evening, and have a little bit more one-to-one time with Harshinder and myself. And that brings our evening to a close, really, except to say thank you for your time. Thank you for attending tonight. I really appreciate you spending this time with us and hearing from Harshinder. And Harshinder, big thank you to you, to Picton's, for agreeing to be our expert this evening on the legal topic of selling. We will be back. This is our last one for the year. We will be back as a company in 2023 with another series of expert webinars. If you've been on any before, we've covered the areas of finance, we've covered tax, and we've covered tonight we've covered legal, and we'll probably launch a few new topics in the new year, such as property management, property refurbishment, to really help our landlords and other clients who are interested in sort of doing things to add value to their property. And one other thing that we'll be launching in probably from February next year is what we're calling buy-to-let workshops, where every 2 months, very informal, 30 to 40 minutes online, where landlords or anyone interested in investment can come along, and we'll be doing online buy-to-let workshops, giving advice about the buy-to-let market, property prices, what's happening, what's trending, what rents are, and taking questions. And that will not just be with me, but that will also be with the senior valuer at VA. So that's something that we'll be talking about and sharing with you guys into 2023. That's it from me this evening. Thank you very much. Like I said, thank you everybody. Thank you, Harshinder, and have a safe, restful night.